in some of the areas. Morning.
Morning. Okay, members, thank you very much, and we're now resuming our session at agenda item 7. So this is the evidence session with the Equality Commission on the Sign Language Bill. The papers for the agenda item, members, start at page 117. And I now would like to welcome the following representatives to the meeting: Geraldine McGahey, who's Chief Commissioner, and Geraldine, you're very welcome back to committee, and Paul Noonan, Senior Policy Officer. Likewise, welcome, Paul. Geraldine, I think it's yourself that's going to make some opening statements before we move to questions from members. So, Commissioner or Chief Commissioner, please go ahead.
Right, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation to be here this morning. And as Chair has said, I'm joined by Paul Noonan, who is one of our Senior Policy Officers with a specific remit in this area, including UNCPD and other issues in relation to disability matters. So as you said, I just want to make a few opening words, and then we'll be very happy to take your questions. But by way of background and context, you'll be aware that the Equality Commission, together with the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, is part of the independent mechanism for Northern Ireland, and which is designated under Article 33.2 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And our role is to promote, protect and monitor the implementation of the Convention in Northern Ireland. And it's within this context that we have established a Disability Stakeholder Forum on which the British Deaf Association is represented. You'll be well aware that accessible communication has continued to be a barrier to deaf and hard of hearing and disabled people in Northern Ireland, accessing not just services, but also their right to freedom of expression and opinion. The UN Committee, the British Deaf Association, the Department for Communities and their Disability Strategy Expert Advisory Panel, and indeed independent research commissioned by ourselves, have all highlighted concerns regarding the limited provision of accessible information and services by public authorities in Northern Ireland. Now, some 21 years after formal recognition of BSL and ISL as languages in their own right, being announced by the then Secretary of State, Paul Murphy, we very much welcome the Sign Language Bill. It's an important step towards meeting the Northern Ireland Executive's obligations under Article 21 of UNCRPD. Provision for the official and equal recognition of BSL and ISL as languages in Northern Ireland is indeed a landmark achievement. It affirms the cultural and linguistic identity of the deaf community and aligns with their views of themselves as a linguistic minority rather than a group of disabled people. It sets a foundation for greater inclusion. And we note that the bill provides for a statutory duty on prescribed public organisations to take reasonable steps to make their services and the information they provide as accessible to individuals in the deaf community as they are to individuals who are not in the deaf community. The commitment to promote the use and understanding of sign languages, the provision and access to sign language education for deaf children and their families, and importantly, a framework for accrediting sign language interpreters and teachers. However, while welcoming this proposed legislation, and we would be mindful not to do anything to undermine it, it is essential that the legislation is robust and enforceable. Otherwise, it remains a laudable publication that fails to live up to its full potential and indeed society's expectations. The Commission in our written submission highlighted a number of areas where the legislation could and should be strengthened, including areas of monitoring and compliance, adequate and dedicated funding, early education support, the scope and existing accessibility duties, digital accessibility, support for wider cultural promotion, ongoing engagement with stakeholders. The detail of those are provided in the briefing that we sent in. So arguably many of those points can be addressed in subsequent regulations. However, there are some areas that cause the Commission ongoing concern. Language used within the bill appears to give the Department a high degree of latitude in many aspects. It will be at the discretion of the Department for Communities as to the extent and the manner in which they promote the use of sign language and how they will work to develop the culture of the sign language community. The Department will have significant freedom as to when regulations will be prepared and given effect, as well as the content of such regulations. The department will have the power to disapply or limit the application of the regulations on prescribed organisations, where the department considers it appropriate, taking account of issues such as the scale of their resources or the type of their operations, etc. Similarly, the issue of guidance referred to within the bill is without a dedicated framework. And also it provides a significant latitude to the department in terms of those guidance. Use of the word may has legal implications. It is not as strong or as compelling as must or shall. These words would be much more preferable throughout the bill. They are used occasionally but very sporadically across the bill, and they would ensure that actions are actually implemented. The word may does provide flexibility and can provide space for creativity, that's without question. But at the same time, it can create uncertainty and the potential for inertia or no progress. Indeed, in this case, the bill, there can be no progress or improvements of our sign language community unless the necessary regulations are brought forward. Until the regulations are enforced, there are no prescribed organisations with the exception of the Northern Ireland Civil Service departments. The bill is silent on when this might be, and there are examples from our own past where progress has not been achieved because regulations simply were not brought forward. And the case of gender pay reporting within the Employment Act is a case in hand. Similarly, the bill states that prescribed organisations must have regard to guidance issued by the department. It would be much more preferable to state that organisations must have due regard to such guidance. Another point of concern is in relation to Article 4.3 of the NCRPD, which requires that in the development and implementation of legislation and policies to implement the Convention and in other decision-making processes concerning the issues relating to persons with disabilities, state parties shall closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities, including children, etc., and their representative organisations. Proposals within the bill that the department consult with at least one person or group acting on behalf of the deaf community sets a minimum standard. It is not the only standard, but it runs the risk of being contrary to the Article 4.3. The bill proposes that prescribed organisations must take all reasonable steps to ensure accessibility of information and services, etc., and to offer or facilitate the use of sign language. Reasonable steps are undefined at this stage and may be more clearly identified in future guidance. However, prescribed organisations are enabled to retain the right to take account of such issues as affordability and practicality as justifiable defence or reasons for not complying with the proposed legislation. It's not dissimilar to the DDA as it currently stands. The Commission acknowledges that while the disability discrimination legislation is not and cannot be an appropriate vehicle for cultural and linguistic recognition, it does nonetheless provide for legal redress where discrimination has occurred against deaf and hard of hearing people. We have supported a number of such cases in recent years, and as stated on many occasions, including before this very committee, we continue to call for the reform of the current disability discrimination legislation in Northern Ireland, which provides much less protection for people here than it does for across the rest of Great Britain. The Commission considers that the Sign Language Bill will complement the disability discrimination legislation in setting forth and underpinning the rights of deaf and hard of hearing people here in Northern Ireland. It shouldn't be underestimated the power that this bill could have, but it is subject to the depth and expanse of the regulations and guidance that come with it. And without that time frame, without the clear direction as to when the department will move forward, it can and will remain a piece of paper sitting on a shelf. And that would be our view. I'm going to stop there. It's more important that we have a dialogue with you and answer as many questions as we can, and we will endeavour to try to do that. If we can't answer a question, we will of course come back to you in writing at a subsequent time. But I think it's over to you now, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Chief Commissioner. That is really useful, I have to say, and really focused in terms of the bill, and I think speaks to a kind of an emerging sort of consensus around a number of issues which are coming up time and time again. In relation to one of those, Commissioner, you've highlighted concerns with Clause 5, which is the requirement to consult with one person. You mentioned that towards the end. And I think that is something that has been raised previously. I mean, the very fact that there's two languages in itself, screams that's probably optimal in a sense. So if that clause should be strengthened, how would you suggest it should be amended to ensure that it is compliant?
It should be amended to be in compliance with Article 4.3 of UNCRPD, that whoever is consulted with is representative of the deaf community. And the deaf community itself agrees that that body or that partnership is indeed representative. I think it should be noted that the department have worked closely with the deaf community in getting to this point. There has been good, strong collaboration, and we would nearly go as far as citing it as best practice. And it would be such a shame if that was to be minimised now by the reference to a minimum of communication with one organisation. It does say, it is a minimum standard, but there's no aspiration to keep that as wide and as open and as inclusive as possible.
Yes, I can maybe add to the remarks the Chief Commissioner has made there in terms of doing some research for the engagement today. I see that on NorthernIrelandDeaf.com news that there are 7 organisations, deaf organisations listed for Northern Ireland, and 10 clubs in addition to that. So, I'm not saying that is a comprehensive list, but it's clear that there are more than one there's more than one organisation providing services to the deaf community.
Okay, thank you. Last one from me then for now, and I'll go to members then, and yet to give everyone a fair chance around the room. So, the paper makes significant points, and the paper is very useful outside of even this discussion, which we will come back to, but makes significant points around UNCRPD recommendations on these matters. I suppose, what's your assessment of how far this bill goes to addressing UNCRPD in terms of implementing that? And in relation to the ownership and management of digital resources, the need for community representation, do you have any thoughts on how that representation may be achieved or promoted?
I think it goes without saying, this bill provides an essential foundation upon which everything else can be built. And as I said earlier, it is the regulations and the guidance that give life to this. This is only the starting point and should never be seen as anything other than the starting point. The other part of your question was in relation to... In relation to
UNCRPD, and we have had discussions around digital resources and how it can be assured that the community has ownership of those. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on how representation can be promoted in that context? Again,
it goes back to who represents the deaf community and all of the parties that are involved in that, and each will have their own needs. But the foundation is there in terms of how the department have previously worked with the deaf community to be able to bring them along in that collaborative approach. And that's really important going forward, because this will be part of the definition and the setting out of the regulations and the guidance. So that, I think, is essential, that the people that are involved in that process are as representative of all of the needs, whether it be ISL, BSL, hard of hearing. All of them need to have an agreement and an acceptance that what is produced meets their needs. Otherwise, you're falling short. And this is too valuable an opportunity to get it right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I'll go to Kelly. Go ahead, Kelly.
Thank you very much. I have a few very specific questions, so bear with me. The first one is about reasonableness. This legislation goes forward and it outlines the intentions. Is it therefore reasonable for any public body or the civil service departments to use affordability as a reason for not complying completely with need, given the fact that the legislation is very clear? you know, that there's certain, or the regulations will make very clear that there's certain standards. And on that as well, on your paragraph 3.28, you talk about essential services. We don't have essential services listed within the legislation that clarifies that. Have you a definition? And the last one then is, with regards to equality, there's a lot of mention about children, which is fabulous, but there's no mention of older people who are deaf or somebody who loses hearing as they go through life. Should there be something included within that to ensure that all sections of society are covered?
Yeah.
That's me.
It should, for the last part first, it should apply to all sections of society. All people who are hard of hearing and deaf should be included regardless of their age. That goes without saying. In terms of using affordability as a reasonable excuse or explanation for not doing something, that is set out within the bill. It will be one of the grounds upon which an organisation, whether they be prescribed or whatever, can explain or try to justify their failure to introduce or make reasonable adjustments. It is the same within the DDA presently. We have taken many service providers through courts to address those issues, and they have been found wanting, and that process will remain. I would say that seeking legal redress under the DDA can be time-consuming, it can be resource-intensive, and it's difficult for people with disabilities to pursue that course of action without the assistance of organisations like ourselves. How long we can continue doing that remains to be seen. Our budgets are continually pressurised and cut, and we're finding that we're unable to help as many people as we might have done in the past, and we can only deal with those big strategic issues. But that still leaves a large cohort of our society that still have the right to seek legal redress, and we can't help them. So I would really like to see something incorporated within the regulations that defines more clearly what a reasonable adjustment or failure to make reasonable a justifiable excuse or explanation, for want of a better word rather than excuse, what that actually means. Because at the moment on the face of the bill, if you can't afford it, it's not practical, therefore you don't have to do it. And I think if the regard to the guidance was strengthened to due regard, it would make it more important that the organisation very clearly sets out how they have considered those issues in detail that is challengeable.
And I suppose then, just to follow on with that one, you've talked in the paper about there isn't a clear complaints process,
Yes.
you know, and how it would be measured about compliance. And who do you think should hold that?
Well, that would be for the department and for members to ensure the holder, if that is clearly identified. The Commission does do that kind of work presently, and we do give advice to organisations as to how they can comply with their duties under the DDA. Disability Action also participate in that process. So there are a number of organisations and bodies that could be identified, and indeed, if the department was willing and had the skill base to do it, they could be doing it themselves. But it would be for the regulations to identify who that would be.
And just the essential services then, what would
Essential services, we would say anyone who provides an essential service to a member of community at large. And if that service is essential to their day-to-day living, their ability to participate in normal society and to be included in society, that should be an essential service. We're not just talking about the emergency services, we're talking about anything that's essential to your day-to-day living and ability to be part of society.
You know, I know we've had correspondence through, and actually we're going to meet somebody shortly that talks about employment, justice and health. So, yeah.
Without question they are, but they are actually covered by the departments, civil service departments that are identified within the bill as automatically being prescribed organisations and won't be consulted with in terms of the regulations and the guidance going forward. But there are other service providers out there who provide an essential element to people's lives, and they're not necessarily public sector organisations. And other organisations can deliver services on behalf of a public body. And we'd like to see those included within these provisions as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Perhaps if I may add that we note that the Scottish Government has a BSL Action Plan 23-29, and it specifies a number of key areas, including employment, health, data, transport, access to justice, participation in public life, and so on. So those are the kind of things that could be potentially included in an action plan drawn up by the department further down the line to implement.
Yeah. If you imagine there's a social policy to increase the participation of older people in society or disabled people or whatever services are needed to help the delivery and the achievement of that social policy, ultimately there's an argument that they could be deemed to be essential to make that policy a reality. And that might be one way of helping understand where we're coming from.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Brian?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your attendance and your paper. Two questions. You said in 5.4 you would like to see having regard to be having due regard.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain the difference that having the word due makes?
Due makes it a more statutory obligation and sets out the specifics of what must be done. It's easier to say that you've had regard to something when you've just, I wouldn't go as far as to say paid lip service, but it would be a less rigorous approach to the consideration of the issues than if it was a due regard.
Right. Well, it leads into my second question, and it is the issue that we've discussed in terms of under paragraph 3. What is the meaning of reasonable steps? Mm-hmm. You know, so I mean, in the draft bill, we're told that it's to ensure that services are as accessible to individuals in the deaf community as they are to individuals who are not in the deaf community, and also offer facilitate the use of BSL or ISL for the benefit of individuals in accessing information and services, and that it should be at no extra cost to the individual, and but that cost, the affordability, could be taken in as a factor. So, I mean, many organisations, the prescribed organisations, wider groups, businesses will be looking at, well, what would be the consequences in practical terms for them. And you've said this provides a foundation that can then be built on. But I think we will end up with a range of provision. You know, at one end of the scale, you could have having interpreters actually physically present at all times, waiting in case somebody comes in requiring use. But a lot of other organisations will have some sort of facility that can be provided by arrangement, you know, with advance notice, and possibly something which is online, you know, which can be accessed. So, but I think what the fundamental step here is that organisations, in particular prescribed organisations, will not be able to say, sorry, we don't do sign language. You know, they will have to. So, because you said earlier that you'd be concerned that they don't have to do it. I think no organisation will be permitted to say, will not be able to say, sorry, we don't do sign language.
They will be able to demonstrate by looking at the resources that they have available that it is too expensive for them to do, or that there isn't a big enough demand for it. That ability to opt out on a reasonable, justifiable reason needs to be clearly defined within the guidance. The guidance needs to come forward with the definition of what reasonable steps should be and set out the parameters within which a justifiable defence can be put forward. The same process applies currently to the DDA and the inability of some providers to be able to make reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities. When you take it through the court, it can be quite an onerous bar to overcome, and we have been very successful in a lot of cases against our own departments as well, where they have failed to make reasonable adjustments for someone with a hearing problem. So the guidance become essential in being able to identify what those thresholds will be. But at the minute, there is no guidance. That comes at a later date. So this is why I'm saying this is the foundation upon which the regulations need to be defined, and this committee and other members will play a very critical role in helping develop those regulations and the guidance, because it has to be about helping and assisting the people with a hearing problem and deaf people. It's about developing the culture of that community because they do not see themselves as being disabled people. If you don't see yourself as being a disabled person, why should you have to rely on disability discrimination legislation to be able to assert your rights? So by having strong and robust legislation such as this, upon which strong regulations and guidance are developed, it helps the identity of those people, it helps their well-being and their feeling of being an inclusive member of society.
Mm-hmm. No, and I don't doubt that there will end up being challenges, of what is reasonable and what is the level of provision. But I think I would expect that we will end up with a range of levels
Absolutely.
of provision according to the size,
Yeah.
of the institution of a
It will be
particular building.
context-based,
But-
without
but-
question.
But I think it does establish at least the foundation that organisations can say, no, we don't provide sign language.
But they can't do that. They would
yeah.
have to justify
It
why
is a
they don't.
practicality,
Yeah.
it's not just a preference, it's a practicality, and it's people's primary language. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I do stress that without proper regulations, this piece of legislation, this bill, will be meaningless. It will not be enacted. It will have no substantive benefit to anyone without good, strong regulations.
Okay, thank you. Sure.
Thank you, Brian. I'll go then next to Melissa.
Fadger Overleg, you're very welcome. I always find it ironic, that when we discuss sign language and its importance, not just in terms of how does it facilitate communication, but included in that is culture and the way that it should be provided for each and every person who requires it, and those that are part of the whole support services and that as well too. And I say ironic in as much as that language very often can be divisive for us within the house itself, within the chamber. But in fact, in your presentation, you really highlight that importance of language in itself, and it's no threat to anyone. And providing the rights of one group does not diminish in any respect the rights of any other person either. Now, just to go back, and I think it was yourself, Paul, that alluded to this point, and I'd like a wee bit of maybe clarity on it, just that where at 3.8 you have actually stated there that it's a bit silent on what safeguarding measures will be put in place to ensure consistent implementation of the guidance. And Paul, then you go on to describe what's happening in Scotland. In fact, are you suggesting then that Scottish model is the preferred model, and that it should be the model that should be adopted here, we'll say, within the north of Ireland as well too? And if so, what is needed in order to ensure that it embraces all of the elements, positive elements, that of the Scottish model?
I don't think we're being prescriptive on the Scottish model. We simply point out to the fact that there's a deficit in the legislation with regard to ensuring a joined-up approach and implementation. The Scottish model is obviously one option there. We're aware that in relation to Section 75, the Civil Service has a standing group of equality officers who meet to share experiences and their approach to Section 75 matters to encourage a more joined-up approach. So I think there are different ways of coming at this, but I suppose Section 75 in terms of its implementation by way of analogy, yes, there's some very proactive public authorities who are very good at looking to fulfil the duties and are creative about their approach to it. At one end, at the other end, you've maybe a smaller number of public authorities who pay lip service, it's probably fair to say, to the duties, and in between you probably have the majority of public authorities. So this issue about trying to ensure a good standard of compliance is one which we think could benefit from being given further attention in the development of this bill.
Morgan, Melissa. Daniel,
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Geraldine and Paul. Thank you for all your work on this generally, and the work you do on a daily basis on this important area. I have to say I share your concerns in relation to the legislation. First of all, welcome. It's an important step forward, but like most pieces of legislation that come through this assembly from departments, it tends not to be as good as it should be in delivering for those that are directly affected. It needs to be inclusive, and there needs to be clear demands within that legislation that ensures that they deliver and it doesn't sit on a shelf. Unfortunately, for years, many strategies and legislation bills have just sat there. And in fairness to Kelly, with the integrated education bill, she put very tough language in there, and the House, with various amendments added to that to ensure that the department actually do what they're committing to do. So I entirely agree with you. This can't be just a box-ticking exercise. A lot of hopes have been raised by this bill coming forward, and we need to ensure we don't continue in letting those people down that have been affected, and ultimately those who will be affected in the future. So I've really nothing to add, only to thank you both for what you are doing. You have the support of this committee, and I certainly do believe that the language, the wording within the legislation does need to be strengthened. And I entirely understand why that is the case. If we want to see action, it needs to be strengthened. So thank you both.
Daniel, Sean.
Yeah, to echo that, thank you so much. The correspondence that we got from you, the submission was really, really helpful, and had highlighted quite a few issues that we had discussed as well. One of the issues around the complaints process and the lack of complaints process that was brought up in one of the consultation events that I was at in Banbridge. It was a really serious issue of contention at the consultation event because of the lack of capacity. As you said, if you are a member of the disabled community, to actually have the capacity to go through that legal process can be out of reach.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, in terms of that enforcement, how in other pieces of particularly equality legislation, are there penalties or are there usual enforcement kind of guidelines that would be best practice that could be brought into this bill?
Under the Disability Discrimination Act, the Commission would assist individuals to seek redress where they believe they've been discriminated against. But ultimately it is for the courts to determine whether or not they have been discriminated against, and they set the penalty. There have been, depending on the situation and the circumstances, if it's in relation to employment, for example, there may well be monetary compensation. This bill is silent on any form of enforcement or redress. And in that absence, that void, the only option that's available to people to assert their rights and seek redress is under the DDA. And we would like to see, perhaps within the regulations, because we really don't want anything to jeopardise the passage of this bill. It's too important for that to happen. But there needs to be a commitment that certain words changing from may to must or shall would really make a massive difference, and indeed setting a time frame for the introduction of regulations, and then you're into that whole development process again where members will have a further opportunity to really participate in the development of those regulations. I think that is what is essential to making this a really valuable piece of legislation that's so desperately needed. Some made comments about the expectations of society. People's expectations have been built. Without question, that's the case. And, it's a really laudable document. So we need to do all we can to make sure that it is as robust as it possibly can be when it eventually gets rolled out. But without those regulations, unfortunately, I reiterate, it will sit on a shelf and it will serve no purpose.
Really appreciate that, and really appreciate just how the strength of your words. I think that's really clear for us. In terms of that enforcement, you mentioned around the fact that yourselves and Disability Action and I are already engaged in something along those lines with the DDA. Can you and tell us what that looks like or what that is in practice?
What we do is the organisations would have disability action plans in terms of how they would deal with that. We provide advice and guidance to employers and service providers on meeting their obligations and the interpretation of the Disability Discrimination Act. That service is free of charge. And likewise, we then provide legal assistance to those who have or believe they have been discriminated against. We can't support all of the cases that come before us, We only support the strategic ones that have the potential to get a message out across wider society. We'd love to support more, but we can't. But we do work very closely with Disability Action and others in terms of being able to assist and interpret the legislation.
When we look at the fact there's a lack of budget linked to this, if we were to look at that and if there were something to be built in around the provision of that enforcement service or that support service, both either to yourselves or to community and voluntary sector organisations like Disability Action, would that be?
It would be.
Would that increase the capacity?
It would be beneficial, and it would increase capacity in respect of this particular bill. And that will be for the department to identify within the regulations if there is to be an enforcement aspect or if they are to rely solely on DDA or whatever the case might be. The bill is totally silent in that regard. So we just
Thank you both so much. Really, really useful contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could just pick up maybe hopefully quickly on a couple of issues that maybe haven't been touched upon. You highlighted, Commissioner, the absence of a complaints process for non-compliance. So what benefit would a complaints process be, and should the bill be amended to include a complaints process in your view?
I think that the complaints process can come forward and recommend in regulations. There needs to be some form of redress. It needs to clarify where that redress would be, where there is a failure. Even Section 75 identifies a form of redress, weak as it might be, but there is a process identified as to the actions that will be taken where an organisation has failed to deliver on the aims of the legislation. So I think that is an important point, and we really can't move forward until that's done. A complaints process will only it will not provide proper redress unless the regulations identified as such. A legal process will provide that. A complaint can be of a minor nature, but again, the regulations can quite clearly stipulate that.
And
Go ahead,
I was just going to say, sort of linked to that is a need also to be proactive about including deaf people and their organisations in the implementation framework, so they can advise as the regulations and the legislation is rolling out, rather than waiting to 5 years and then conducting a review at that stage. You know, a lot can happen within 5 years, and you know it's more likely to be positive if deaf people are involved from the outset. And indeed, as the Chief Commissioner mentioned, you know, Article 4.3 of the UNCRPD requires that in the development and implementation. So that's what we're talking about here, is implementation. Yes, deaf people were involved in the development of this, but it's about implementation, and it's about active involvement. You know, the Article 4.3 talks about consultation with and actively involving. So it's not just a one-off consultation. Actively involving implies that that's an ongoing process.
Just to clarify in terms of a complaints process, a complaints process can quickly and speedily resolve an issue that helps a person who feels they're not getting the proper service. Normally, within the public sector, if someone has made a complaint and a complaints procedure fails to deliver an outcome that they're happy with, they have a course of redress to, for example, a public service ombudsman. And there's no reason why a similar process could not be incorporated within this that negates the need for legal action.
Okay, thank you. Just to clarify a couple of points related to that. So you have been very strong on the regulations. Did you say, and apologies if I missed this, did you say that the time frame for the regulations should be in the bill?
I feel it should. I think it would make sure and signal to all parties that this is going to be real and impactful, and it's not going to sit on a shelf, that it has a definite journey to be completed within a specific time frame, and I think that would really strengthen it.
Okay, and before I go to Kelly there, and you have touched on, Paul, around the review. So is 5 years too long for a review process? Should we be looking at that to be amended to a quicker review, given this is particularly for the first review? And do you think the terms of reference for that review should be included in the bill?
It would add to the bill if it did include a terms of reference, but it's not essential. It can be incorporated at a later date within the regulations. My honest view is that I believe 5 years is fairly appropriate because you need to give this time to bed in and for problems to be identified and the opportunity to put them right and try and see what works best to be able to gather the evidence to make it meaningful. There's no point in carrying out a review at the end of 1 year. It's too soon. So I think 5 years is fairly appropriate, and a review of this nature could be fairly resource intensive as well in terms of the amount of engagement and evidence gathering that might be required. But it would be within the gift of the department to include that within regulations.
Clearly, one of the provisions of the bill is that designated authorities develop action plans, but the bill is silent. Perhaps the regulations will address this on when the due date for the development of those will be, and obviously that's also linked to the
and how they would be approved.
For the period of the review.
Okay, thank you, Kelly.
I was just going to say there's a lot of talk of regulations, but none are listed in this bill. Do you think it'd be beneficial or more appropriate for at least a start list with, at the review, any further regulations as needed, that we should be listing them on the face of the bill?
Well, I think the bill itself in its current form does stipulate where regulations would be required. I wouldn't be overly prescriptive in what should or shouldn't be included in the regulations, because, as I said, a little bit of ambiguity can create a
Not
space.
in the regulations, even just a list of
even in
what
the
they
bill,
are.
if you feel strongly that there are other issues that you've heard from the various pieces of evidence that you've received, that yes, that would be beneficial to be in the actual bill, that the regulations will cover this issue, I would add them in. But I would encourage you not to delay the incorporation of this, but to make sure that you're confident that the regulations will cover them. But I would be looking for a time frame for the introduction of the regulations.
Okay, well listen, thank you, and that's greatly appreciated, I have to say, and thank you members for a very thorough look at various aspects. It's been really useful, and it's very useful to have your paper on this, Commissioner, as well. So thank you very much, and we'll take your comments.
If you need anything further, just let us know, and we'll address it to the committee clerk.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Appreciate that.
We will move straight on to agenda item 8. I think there's a bit of technical apologies. We'll move straight on without.
Okay, members, so we are going to move straight on now to agenda item 8, which is our evidence session with Adapt NI on the Sign Language Bill. So the papers for the agenda item, members, start there at page 131, and we'll now welcome the following representatives to the meeting.
Good points they're making.
Thank you, Chris. So now we'd now like to welcome the following to the meeting. We have Laura Murphy-Sloan, who's the Director, and Alex Leslie, also a Director of Adapt NI. So Laura, I think it's yourself that's going to make some opening remarks, and then we'll go to questions from members.
So good morning. Thank you for the opportunity for us to give evidence today. So before I begin, I'd just like to briefly share a bit about who we are, if that's okay. So my colleague Alex and I, we are both hearing. We co-founded Adapt NI in July 2022. This was following the closure of the only face-to-face employment service for deaf people in Northern Ireland. We are a small but committed team of 5 working NI-wide, and actually 2 of our team are profoundly deaf, one of which is deafblind. Our advisory group are made up of members from both the deaf and hearing loss communities. So we established Adapt NI because we witnessed the serious and growing gap in employment services. We've seen firsthand the impact this has on people's lives, not just on their job prospects, but on their well-being, their mental health, financial security, and, well, really overall independence. So we don't come here to criticise or cause delay, and actually it's quite the opposite. We are incredibly grateful for the work that has brought us to this point, especially the Sign Language Partnership Group. What has happened over recent years, it's a snowball effect. More deaf awareness, more learning of ISL and BSL, and more recognition. We would like to contribute ideas that we feel could strengthen the bill And we say openly that everything that we should suggest should ultimately be shaped and led by the wider deaf community, who we are proud to stand in support of. So why we feel employment must be a core pillar on the bill. So while Clause 2 promotes the use of BSL and ISL and encourages cultural and educational support, it does not include employment. So our initial and hopefully today's evidence highlights the need for employment to be explicitly added, with long-term duties to support accessible recruitment, workplace interpreters, workable NI skill set which we deliver, style services and training. We strongly believe that this bill must include a dedicated permanent clause on employment. Yes, we have the DDA and Section 75, so they offer legal protections, but they're not enough, and this is why we feel why. So the DDA is limited, it is reactive. Protections only kick in after disadvantage has occurred. Reasonable adjustments, it's open to interpretation, often leading to under-provision or delays, and it does not actually promote BSL or ISL, it just responds to complaints. It does not require systematic or strategic change, especially in the public sector workplaces, and it's broad. Section 75 can be broad and policy focused, promotes equality but not enforcing practical BSL or ISL access in the workplace. It does not apply to private sector employees, where many deaf people actually work, unless they're delivering on public service contracts. It relies heavily on equality impact assessments and voluntary compliance, not practical daily support for deaf employees. So although these frameworks are important, they are not sufficient to address the persistent employment gap experienced by BSL and ISL users. This legislation gives us a once-in-a-generation opportunity to embed language rights into all aspects of life, including work. A dedicated employment clause would make proactive duties clear, like accessible recruitment, signed training, and workplace inclusion. It would support the funding for interpreters and technology NI-wide, and make a parity with the rest of the UK, especially in relation to access to work. It would promote public sector leadership in inclusive employment, make workplace BSL and ISL awareness training standard, and provide clarity beyond reasonable adjustments with clear expectations for inclusive practice. So recognition of BSL and ISL is important, but it means little if people can't use their language in the workplace, or if barriers continue to block access to jobs, career progression and independence. At Adapt NI, we support people who are ready and willing to work, but can't attend interviews because there's no interpreter, who are in jobs they can't progress from because support is piecemeal, who face employers who want to help but don't have training or tools. So we do have some proposed wording that we would put forward. We can share that with you. Our second one would be in relation to a representative regulatory advisory board, which would be in reference to clause 5, 7 and 8. We feel there's a need to ensure that consultation is real, structured and representative. The current wording that one person or group must be consulted, we don't feel it's enough, as the deaf community is diverse, with different experiences, identities and needs. And a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really speak for everybody. So we would strongly recommend the creation of an official advisory board made up of both deaf, BSL and ISL users across Northern Ireland. We would hope that this would actually be voted on by the community, regulated and transparent, and be reviewed or refreshed annually or biannually to reflect the changing needs and ensure accountability. This would give the community a real voice in shaping how the bill is implemented and evaluated. So a consultation wouldn't be just a tick box, it would be a living democratic process. And then person-led access to communication. So finally, we believe there's a need for personal, flexible access to communication. Clause 3 focuses on making public services accessible in both to BSL and ISL users, but it does include a loophole allowing public bodies to consider cost and practicality. Really important that we try to meet this gap. So currently deaf individuals are actually limited by access to work rules. For example, if they work under 16 hours, they can't actually access to work. And for some people, this could be their first job, or maybe just getting into the workplace. and that includes at the interview process as well. So we would support a person-led communication alliance where individuals can book interpreting or video relay services for life moments that matter, supporting independence, dignity and full participation in society. So in conclusion, we know one day our services won't be needed and we look forward to that day. But we are not there yet, and to get there we need the legislation to support us and more importantly to support the community that we serve. We thank you again for the opportunity to contribute and sincerely hope the evidence is received in the spirit in which we are giving it today, respectfully, constructively and with the aim of helping Northern Ireland lead the way in inclusion, language-based equality.
Okay, thank you, and that's really useful as well. Some really practical suggestions and very, very interesting given your perspective. I have to say I'm struck overall by the value that there's been in the co-design that has taken place to date in relation to this bill. It really threads through all of the work, and I think the idea of maintaining that principle and maintaining that reiterative process as we go forward in this bill and many other areas is of huge value as well as importance. So just in relation to your concerns on clause 5 and your paper has indicated that specific point that a diverse community cannot be represented by one stakeholder, and I think that has come up as a theme quite often. I suppose the other side of that coin is that frequent wide consultation can delay action. So where would you see the balance in relation to that, and how do you think the bill could be improved to take account of your concerns in that respect?
We would hope that there could be some kind of advisory group that would be put together as part of the deaf community. If this could be something that's voted to get on to, so maybe you would have representatives from different parts of the deaf community. Maybe it's an annual voting procedure, but it also gives opportunities for people who are deaf to take on that type of responsibility, that type of experience, and creates then future opportunities for them as well as being part of something so big.
Okay. You've highlighted some concerns around the requirement to take reasonable steps. In your view, does that phrase significantly weaken the bill, and should that phrase be clarified, strengthened by the department, and if so, how would you like to see it strengthened?
I think it is the word reasonable. I think we maybe need to expand on that slightly, including what is reasonable, and reasonable is open to so many different perspectives. It depends who's reading the reasonable statement. And if it's a small business, what is reasonable for a small business may not be reasonable for what a larger business that would have a lot more finances in place. So it's about trying to meet that gap, and especially in relation to somebody that maybe is going for an interview. We are coming at this obviously from a very much an employment perspective, but if a small business does not have the finance to fund an interpreter, who's going to fill that gap? Let's find a way that there can be a provision in place for somebody that it's still reasonable for them to then apply for an additional maybe fund to put that in place.
Okay, thank you. And the final one from me then for now before we go to members is in relation to clause 2, and you have highlighted that you're concerned that it doesn't go far enough in ensuring access to services. So in terms of any strengthening of the bill in that respect, would you like to see that placing more statutory duties on public bodies, and how what do you think those should be?
Our issue is really that it does promote BSL and ISL, cultural, educational support, but there's a complete lack of employment. So that is really what we come today to say. We see employment as a core pillar of opportunity for the Northern Ireland deaf community. And very much, I know we have additional legislation in place and we have the DDA, but we really need to be seeing this with importance, that this employment is a key area in Northern Ireland for everybody. So it should be seen as a key area for the sign language users, deaf community as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. So I'm going to go first of all to Kelly. Go ahead.
Thank
Kelly.
you. I agree that employment is a key area, given the fact that Northern Ireland has the highest number of people with disabilities out of work. It's something that we should be absolutely focusing on. Can I just ask you, are you aware of any legislation or regulations that are in the rest of these islands that reflect what you're talking about, support for people in employment, not just about education, but about, the wider life skills? Are you aware of anything that we could take a look at to maybe add
It
in?
is noted on the other acts. So Scotland have, now it just says access to work, but employment is still on there. I think it's really important that as a starting point, and also by leading by example as well, you know, this is the new one that's coming through. So if we can have employment on there, and if there's anything we can support with, like, we stand ready to help.
The other thing was, in the bill, it talks about the provision of support for children and people around them. So it could be family, friends, teachers. I think I've started to lose my hearing in later life, and it would be much more beneficial for me if my work colleagues had access to appropriate training so that I could communicate better with them. Do you think then that if we added in, or if there was a consideration to add in a part on employment, that we should be looking to replicate the provisions for children for the workplace, so that there's access to training, not just so that the person can attend employment and be included as a full member of that workforce, but also that the communications of their colleagues would be improved?
We do this on a daily basis. We deliver training to businesses, employees, colleagues, Northern Ireland wide. This is something that we see as a key part of awareness raising, really, Northern Ireland wide. So yes, absolutely. It takes everybody. It's not just for the deaf person to say, I have hearing loss, I'm deaf, I need, it's very much for us to be more proactive in the approach that the environment needs to change, and that's the whole societal approach that we should be taking, environmental approach. It's changing the environment.
This bill doesn't define what promotion will look like. So I wondered, at the moment, Department for Communities is investing through councils for employment hubs, particularly looking at access to employment for people with disabilities. Given the fact that you've said that there could be a difference between a large employer or a small employer, should we be considering then supporting employers by giving them access to information and awareness about deaf communication, how the company should be adhering to legislation, and just to help them at a localised level? Would that be something that might be useful for the Department for Communities to consider using those employment hubs to also help the employers?
I think any awareness is good awareness. It's very much about trying to change the landscape. We are working, as I said, a team of 5 Northern Ireland wide. We are getting into as many employers and businesses, organisations as we possibly can. So the more people that raise awareness, the better.
You've also said in your paper, which was very interesting to me, that government shouldn't be depending on not-for-profits. Could I maybe suggest a change to that and say, work away and use not-for-profits, but fund them fairly? I know yourselves, Adapt NI, have issues with funding and have had issues with funding. Do you think that there should be something maybe spelled into maybe this legislation that requires fair recompense for organisations who are providing the supports?
I think that should fall under reasonable adjustments. So if the organisation, well, I'll give you a bit of example about us, if that's okay, if you have a couple of minutes. So we self-funded Adapt NI to set Adapt NI up. We deliver Skillset, which is a pre-employment and training programme, and Workable, which is an in-work support programme to support people to retain employment. There are a lot of people that don't fit into either of those categories. We support them because it's the right thing to do. So not-for-profits, social enterprises are picking up a lot. Our training with communication costs twice as much as the training costs, because that's what you do. So yeah, if there is a way to try to support, to make training, maybe if there are funding opportunities for people to make sure that they have those in place, that would be brilliant.
Because if they don't, then they sit unemployed and they miss out on the opportunities of employment.
We still support them because it's the right thing to do.
No, thank you. That's been really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that focus on work is really interesting, in the sense that it overarches so much of what we do as an executive, let alone Department of Communities. And the phrase which I always contest around economic inactivity, because it's kind of has almost a judgmental. In fact, I think we'd be much better calling it what it really is very often, which is economic disadvantage, and people being locked either partially or fully out of the opportunity to engage in work. And I think that's the approach that we should be looking at. So I think that's very welcome. One from me, just in relation to clause 7, does set out some of the regulations that the department may make, and we have talked about that, the language in that. But are there other things that you would like to see included within, on the face of the bill, in terms of regulations that you think could be included, be made as part of this bill?
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add. Do you have anything to add?
Okay, well, listen. So, and
Wider
if
group,
there's
yeah.
anything further, you can always include that as a follow up. If there's anything further, but I think that's been a really useful perspective on the bill, I have to say, and one that probably has been, hasn't focused or been brought as clearly. So I think it adds real value to our considerations in that respect. And I want to thank you very much for bringing that to committee today. Any other questions, members, before we move on along? No? Go ahead, Brad.
Just in terms of your own organisation, do you get support from shared prosperity funding currently? Right. And then you've experienced the cuts, have you, as well?
Yes.
That other groups have? Yeah, no, that's an issue that we continue to highlight. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
that funding obviously is only for this next year. It finishes in March, so
Right, yes.
and then it's going to be what's next.
Yes. And you haven't heard? Yeah. No.
Not yet.
Okay.
So we obviously were in the position that we had to go to our advisory group and decide what we were going to do. So 2 weeks before we found out that our team were going to be continuing, and we were trying to support them to look for other work, because we don't want anybody to be held back. We don't want to be given fixed term contracts, but that's how you're stuck within this nature of work. But they stayed, and we were able to then get the 1 year extension.
Yeah.
But it's a very uncertain delivery. It should be a permanent. If we're the only one, there's only one, we're the only people delivering this for the deaf, hearing loss and tinnitus communities.
Right.
It should be a permanent provision. There should always be access to employment and training.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully we have been able to give that evidence today.
Absolutely, I think very effectively. So, thank you very much,
Okay, thanks
Alex
for your
and Laura. Thank you, and good luck for the rest with your work, and very important work it is as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, members. So, any other follow-up actions, members, in relation to either of those two sessions? If members want to note, or content that we go ahead.
Could I just ask that we have a few matters that are coming forward? I know we're still early in this process, but when will we start to go back to the department on potential changes or agree, even at this early stage? Like, for instance, that one representative of the deaf community, I think everybody knows that's not going to cut it. But how quick will we do that, or is that still months away?
So we are collating and arranging evidence, both written and oral evidence sessions, by clause, and our proposal is certainly before recess to be coming back to make clear to members which of the clauses are, if you like, shared concerns, which have some concern, not necessarily shared, and which seem to be at the moment. And we can then ask members, if and how they would like to draw that attention, or provide an update on feedback to the department and so on. But I think we're now getting to the point where we do have the body is building now. So, but I would imagine after another couple of evidence sessions, and perhaps after the June less formal session that we're proposing to hold with stakeholders, we will then have a clearer picture, which we will bring back to members in certainly in time that a decision can be made on next steps before summer recess, if that.
I have a number of amendments I might like the committee to consider that's following on from that. Is it any use sending those through to you guys, or it's too early yet?
Well, no, we'll certainly receive them and start building up, if you like, that side of the work for the committee, which perhaps will be considered in more detail in the autumn period. But nevertheless, absolutely no harm in us receiving those now.
You still my heart. It's getting into that detailed time. James is going, oh no.
Okay, and that's useful. I would always say to members as well as the amendments in face of the bill, we also will be doing a report, and we should be conscious and trawling for what goes into that report as well. So it's an important part of the process. Okay, if members are content with that for now, that does conclude the evidence sessions. Our next item then is a closed session briefing from the Department on the anti-poverty strategies. Are members content we suspend briefly before that session begins? So we'll take a 5-minute break there, members. Thank you. And we'll ask Katie to take.
Committee Room 29. Sound.